This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. From the launch your online shop stage, all the way to the we just hit 1 million orders stage. No matter what stage you're in, Shopify's there to help you grow. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/special offer, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/special offer.
With supply chains becoming more complex, you need to stay on top of the latest logistics developments. So if you work with logistics, you need the Beyond the Box podcast from Maersk. It's the easy way to keep up to date with everything from digital disruption in logistics to the need for supply chain resilience in today's market. Find out more and keep ahead of the game with the Beyond the Box podcast on logistics insights at maersk.com/insights.
Fiction writing 101 is like, you pick a unique detail of someone's appearance. Like, you don't describe the whole thing, and you definitely don't comment on, like, if they're fat or thin or tall or whatever. Like, it's just sort of, all people are spirits and they're moving through the world and whatever. And I'm like, no.
Welcome back to Working. I'm your host, June Thomas.
And I'm your other host, Ronald Young Jr.
Ronald, it is so nice to be talking with you again. And tell me, whose voice did we hear at the top of the show?
That was Emma Copley Eisenberg. She is a writer and the author of the nonfiction book, The Third Rainbow Girl, which is a book that follows the investigation of the murders of Vicky Durian and Nancy Santomero.
And why did you want to speak with Emma right now?
So Emma was originally a fiction writer, but her first book was a work of nonfiction, as I just mentioned, Third Rainbow Girl. But she just released her second book, Housemates, which is a work of fiction about two young queer people who go on a road trip for a journalism assignment, but also end up discovering more about themselves and each other and the world. And it's a fun romp.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I am super excited to hear this interview, but tell me, do you have anything up your sleeve exclusively for Slate Plus members?
I absolutely do. In the Slate Plus segment, Emma and I touch a little bit on her personal inspirations for writing, but then we dive deeper into another one of the themes of the book, Housemates, in the idea of the toxic mentor and toxic mentorship. Ooh. And there's this idea that art can save your life, but if that idea is true, then it stands to follow that it's also important who is teaching the art. So we actually go through another passage in her book as well, and it's just a very fascinating segment of conversation.
Wow. Well, if you're a member of Slate Plus, you will hear that at the end of the episode. And if you aren't, let me tell you, it is really, really easy to join. And as a Slate Plus member, you get to hear extra segments like the one you just heard about and others on shows like the Culture Gabfest and Care and Feeding, the parenting podcast formerly known as Mom and Dad Are Fighting. You'll get bonus episodes of podcasts like Slow Burn, and of course, you'll never hit a paywall on slate.com. To learn more, go to slate.com/workingplus. All right, let's hear Ronald's conversation with Emma Copley Eisenberg.
Raise your hand if you are burnt out.
If email is something that gives you like a shiver in your spine.
You are not alone. I'm Shirley Leung, host of Say More from the Boston Globe. Our new series is Beating Burnout. We'll hear from Cal Newport, Krista Tippett, and more. We'll talk about breaking bad habits and forming new ones.
The cure for burnout is all of us caring for each other.
Say More from the Boston Globe. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.
Who are you and what do you do?
I'm Emma Copley Eisenberg. I am a writer. I am a teacher of creative writing. I am a sort of bookish person about Philadelphia. Started a community-based literary center in Philly for writers from all walks of life. So yeah, mainly writing and talking about writing.
Nice. And most recently, you wrote the book Housemates, which just came out. Congratulations.
I did indeed write that book. Yeah, it's exciting. It's been long in the works, which I'm sure we'll get into. And I have my first book was nonfiction, called The Third Rainbow Girl. So I'm kind of moving between genres. Very interested in storytelling in many forms. So who knows? Maybe I'll write a poetry book next.
I love it. What's your writing process like? Do you have like a routine? What do you do? Do you write every day? There's people that there are different schools of thoughts on what a routine should look like in writing. Do you have a specific perspective on this?
Yes, everything works differently for different folks, but my way is I do end up being quite, it's a little bit feast or famine. Like I will write consistently, obsessively every day for, many months. And then there will be months where I haven't written, depending on like if I'm teaching courses that semester or life is lifing. I had a parent loss this year, so there were many months I didn't write. I think it's okay. I think people get into this like really wild place where they're like, oh, I haven't written for X number of days. I'm not a writer anymore. And I'm like, slow your roll. Yes, you are. But when I'm in it and things are going well, like ideally it's Monday through Friday, 2 to 3 hours in the morning. I do like to decrease as much as possible the amount of time between waking up and writing because I find my anxiety just kind of kicks in later in the day. And it's like, oh, it's 1 o'clock and like I've done nothing. Like I'm a failure at life, So if I can get in there somewhere in the morning before the anxiety really spikes, it's most productive for me. Yeah.
You mentioned the parent loss, and here on Working, we talked recently about how those types of interruptions in our lives, especially like a sick parent or losing a parent, is something that kind of begins to play into your work and how you're able to complete your work or do your work. So I lost my mother actually last Sunday. So I'm still like kind of reeling. Still reeling.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
I appreciate it. I know you know the fraternity. I was looking through your work. It's a club that nobody wants to be in. So, but I'm glad to be able to talk about it with people who have experienced it themselves. But like with that, absolutely. Talking about that, like, how does that impact your work? How are you getting through those humps where you're really dealing with something big and emotional, but you still have work to do?
Certainly. Oh, man. I mean, I'm like kind of floored you're here. So, wow. I mean, I think it took me, the timing was interesting because I believe I was in copy edits for Housemates, this novel, when my dad went into what would become like his final hospital stay. Mm-hmm. And so that was, it's always like really tough. And it was in some ways like a blessing because I was already through most of the creative labor on the book, like thinking through the big questions. Mm-hmm. But there was still a lot to be done. As you know, like getting from copy edits to the book you hold in your hands is still a pretty involved process. So I did have to kind of like figure out ways to carve out that mental clarity in the midst of grief. I think that it's also in some ways like maybe interesting to think about like how does grief go into a project? Like you said, maybe it's not so much about suppressing it or moving it to the side, but thinking about how it can show up in the work. I'm sure I'll be writing about that for many years. And it's, I hope that I like was able to take some of those big feelings and channel them into the book, into the book's last legs of the book's life, in a way that like reflects that time. But sometimes it's just been me like watching my shows, like my distraction grief coping shows, while I just hope that the book, gets out there and finds her readers. So sometimes it's creative and sometimes it's coping and sometimes all of the above.
That's good to know. It's actually really helpful. I think one of the things I've learned, especially with any creative endeavor, is that grief is always going to be there. Whether it's recent grief or grief from a distance, it's just always going to be there. So I find that like learning to live with it and let it weave in and out of your life is probably the most, I've found the most productive way to move forward. Even when you're channeling bits of that into your work. Now, this is going to be the worst pivot I've probably ever done in an interview.
That's okay. It's all living alongside each other at the same time. Yeah.
But when we're talking about, we're talking mostly about your second book, which just came out, which is fictional. But like you mentioned, your first book is nonfiction. So talk to me a little bit about how The Third Rainbow Girl came to be and how you felt writing fiction versus nonfiction.
Mm-hmm. I was getting my MFA in fiction at UVA in the years like 2012 to 2015. And it's like hard to remember way back in the days of yore of those years, but like it was a very difficult series of years in Charlottesville in particular. There was that big Rolling Stone, A Rape on Campus piece came out about UVA's rape culture, which, again, it's like hard to remember, that ended up sort of unraveling on a couple of factual issues. And then there was just a very strong sort of proto-Trump, like pre-Trump's election, like white supremacist vibe, if you will, coalescing in Charlottesville at that time. Yeah, it was quite a vibe, and it was intense, and it was really anti-Black and really misogynist and really scary. And those forces were already gathering in those years before they would become like the Unite the Right and Trump's election and other things. And I became involved with some local organizing in Charlottesville, and I just started to feel this like big disconnect between the things we were talking about in the classroom for fiction in my creative writing master's program and the things that were going on and being seen in Charlottesville proper. And there was also two like pretty high profile missing persons cases. One was like a white cis girl, UVA student named Hannah Graham, who was went missing and then later found murdered in Charlottesville, and a Black trans woman named Sage Smith who went missing, who has still not been found. And the sort of like discrepancy between the way those two crimes were talked about, understood, felt in the community was just so drastic that I started reporting on Sage Smith's disappearance a little bit for a local paper, got very like passionate about that, and I just felt like that I couldn't go into my little room and write like my short stories about whatever at that moment. Like
I get it.
I don't, which like isn't always true. Like I certainly think fiction has an essential role to play in our lives and in empathy and all these things. But at that particular moment, it was just like, this isn't the way. Like, this doesn't make sense for me. And I started getting like more and more involved in conversations in Charlottesville and in the Southeast about gender and race. And I ended up feeling really called to like retread some experiences that I'd had previously when I lived in this part of Central Appalachia called Pocahontas County, West Virginia. So I sort of like taught myself reporting skills and how to create a narrative based on just what the project required. Like that sounds kind of woo-woo, and I know you guys have talked about this in other episodes, but the idea that like the project sort of teaches you what it requires or what form it wants to take. And I like had written some stories about Pocahontas County, West Virginia as fiction, and it just was bad. Like, it just didn't work. Like, I didn't have the lived experience. I didn't have the language. I didn't have a lot of elements that would require good fiction. And nonfiction just kind of, it just kept evolving in that direction. So, yeah, I just kind of followed it. And then, so in some ways, the nonfiction was like the deviation in a way. And fiction, coming back to fiction for this novel feels sort of like coming home or coming back to, like, territory that's a little more playful and delightful and embodied, and I love writing scenes. I love kind of erecting like a fun superstructure to tell a story. That's kind of like my home base. So it's been really fun to come back to fiction, and the projects are very different. Like if you look at the covers, it's like the third Rainbow Girl is like dark, 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 and Housemates is like Technicolor pink and green. And those are the two sides of my personality, apparently.
I love that. I'm wondering what was the inspiration for Housemates specifically? You know, I know you said coming back to fiction was like coming home, but this story, and to be honest, like I'm currently reading it and I'm about 100 pages in, and one thing that I noticed was that the way that you set scenes and talk about the locations, they read like actual locations and places and scenes, and I knew immediately that you were drawing a lot from your lived experience. So like, what is that the inspiration for this story, your actual lived experience? Like it, and I guess I don't want to get too much into like who is you or any of that, but talk to me about the inspiration for Housemates.
So like the very, very, very first seed and spark of Housemates was actually a historical inspiration. So I guess I certainly do have an interest in like looking outside myself for stories and looking at the world, which could manifest in different ways. But so in the 1930s, right around the Great Depression, there was this large format photographer named Bernice Abbott, who's kind of like, if you're like a photo nerd or maybe a New York art nerd, you might have heard of her. She's like well known in photo land, but not really outside of that. And she was a very sort of modern, rigorous, very attentive to the real and representing change in America and New York specifically. That was like her vibe. And then she had this really amazing artistic collaborator who was also her life partner, her romantic partner, who was an art critic named Elizabeth McCausland, who very few people, if anyone, has heard of. But I learned by accident, again, like the accidents of creative work, but like I stumbled onto an exhibit of Bernice Abbott's work and then a biography that I learned that in 1935, the two of them, so a photographer and an art critic, went on a road trip through America, right around the Great Depression and before everything completely changed. And they created this like body of work that's about the way America was changing at that time during the Depression. And they also like stayed in hotels and like had a good amount of sex, I think, and fell in love. It's a little off the record. Their romantic life is not well documented, sort of lost to history. But I got really interested in this idea of like, what would happen if you had a road trip at a very historically significant time where everything was changing and you had a photographer and a writer in the car. That was kind of like the origin of it. And I knew I didn't want to write a historical novel, not least because there is a cool historical novel about Bernice Abbott already, and also I just done all this research for Third Rainbow Girl, and also I'm pretty obsessed and excited about my neighborhood in West Philly, and I got really like excited about, obviously, yes,
in the book.
I got really, it's so much in there, yeah, sorry to
No, don't apologize. I mean, that's one thing that like is very charming is like your love for West Philly really comes through.
Good. I hope, yes, it's love, which means you can also poke gentle fun. But yeah, I thought that I was like, well, what would happen? Where would these people live now? What would be the site of like some place that's really interesting and changing rapidly? And for me, Philadelphia is really that city, and West Philly in particular is that neighborhood where you can see not only gentrification, which is definitely a huge force in West Philly, but also just kind of like changing political mores, changing sense of what's important, what questions we should be asking. And then Philly as a city, you know, we decided the 2020 election, and Pennsylvania as a state is such a really interesting divided sort of place where so many of these forces are coming together that we see in broader American life. So I was like, okay, they're going to live in West Philly. They're going to live in a queer, chaotic group house. And there's going to be like some intimacy that comes from them being housemates that is going to get explored on their road trip. So those are sort of like the early elements.
We'll be back with more of Ronald's conversation with Emma Copley Eisenberg. We've all been there. You have a question about your credit card. You call the number for help and can't get a hold of anyone. If only you had a Discover card. With 24/7 US-based live customer service from Discover, everyone has the option to talk to a real person anytime, day or night. Yep, you heard that right, a real person. Get the customer service you deserve with Discover. Limitations apply. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
Hey Slate listeners, I'm Christina Cauterucci, the host of Slow Burn, Gaze Against Briggs. I want to tell you about a special event we're doing at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York City on June 13th. To celebrate this new season of Slow Burn and Pride Month, we're hosting an exclusive live taping of the show with special guests, including civil rights activist and Black Lives Matter organizer DeRay McKesson, comedian and singer Esther Fallick, Eric Marcus, the host of Making Gay History, and Sam Feder, director of the Netflix documentary Disclosure, about the depiction of trans people in film and television. We'll dive deeper into this season and talk about the lasting impact of the Briggs Initiative and the continued fight over LGBTQ rights in schools. It'll be the perfect way to celebrate Pride Month this June with LGBTQ stories and voices across generations. Again, that's June 13th at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York. You can get tickets now at tribecafilm.com/slowburn. Hope to see you there.
Listeners, we want to hear from you. Every other Thursday on Working Overtime, we offer advice on how to get creative work done. So please tell us your challenges, tell us your successes, and let us help you and help others. Drop us a line at working@slate.com. You can also send a voice memo to that address, or you can give us a ring at 304-933-WORK and leave a message. And if you're enjoying this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Working wherever you get your podcasts. Now let's return to Ronald's conversation with Emma Copley Eisenberg.
I have a couple of passages, so I probably do the cardinal sin, which is I highlight books and I write in them.
No, I love that.
I've been highlighting this one and writing this one. Thank you for the permission. And there's early on in page 8, there is something that kind of I noted, and you wrote this passage. It says, I decided to chance it, getting in line behind a bosomy person with a thigh tattoo of a rat eating a piece of pizza. The tattoo peeked out from where her pants, very short, ended, and her socks, very tall, began. I read this and I was like, this is so descriptive. I see this person, I've known this person, and I've noticed that you tend to lean into the descriptive particularly. Like you lean into it. And I'm wondering, is this something that you would say is common in all of your writing, or was this new for you? What draws you to write this way?
Yes, I think it's actually really interesting. I remember very clearly at my MFA program, my professor at the time was like, why are you always describing what people look like, and why are you always describing what people are wearing? And I was like, I don't know. Like, I didn't have the language for it then, I think. And I think the sort of common wisdom in like fiction writing 101 is like, you pick a unique detail of someone's appearance. Like, you don't describe the whole thing, and you definitely don't comment on like if they're fat or thin or tall or whatever. You know, like it's just sort of all people are spirits and they're moving through the world and whatever. And I'm like, no, like I think people's bodies and what they're wearing are essential to how they exist in the world and how we interact with them in the world, and what assumptions we make and how we touch or don't touch them. And so like with this person, I was like, well, yeah, I mean, again, West Philly is such a queer like space that you never know what person's gender, you never know what pronouns they are using. That was interesting, especially writing from an older queer woman's perspective, which the beginning of the book is in. I was trying to think about ways to like be true to like how would her eyes actually be seeing this human being, but without like deciding who the person was on the page. So bosomy is like another way of saying like plumper or bigger boobs or like but bosomy I think is it's accurate as well, and it's conjuring, you know. And then the sense of like the clothing, I think clothes are very queer. Like clothes are how queer people signal what kind of queer you are, or what you care about, or what your values are, or what your gender expression is. So I think by focusing on clothes, I was actually trying to write for like a queer audience or like a queer gaze. I just didn't know it yet. Yeah.
I love that. I think when I was reading through it, I could, it's just so visual, the descriptive and the way that you're doing it, it's accurately doing exactly what it is that you're trying to do. You did mention this about the perspective of the elder queer person who's unnamed at this point in the book. And I don't know if you go on to name them later, but I remember like early in the book, I'm like, this person is unnamed. And you use a very interesting kind of device, which is that they are kind of following Bernie and Leah, and then they kind of just know everything about them, and they become the narrator of the story. As far as where I am now, I'm excited to finish the rest of it. Why did you choose this perspective? Why was this our way in?
Totally. Yes. And like, indeed, the narrator is this kind of like unclear first person, almost like a little bit of a fairy tale narrator or something, like a little bit pushy. She has thoughts about everything. Yes. Yes. So I did not intend this to be the case. I feel like this hopefully makes sense for this podcast, but it's like sometimes things just happen to you in the creative writing process that you were not expecting. And I'm not that woo-woo of like a person, actually. I was raised in a very like non-woo-woo household, like not even tarot, no astrology, no religion, absolutely not. Like we're very secular Jews. But one day I was writing Bernie and Leah's sections. I was writing them in sort of more normie, like close third, like just sort of inside these two young queer people's heads, like sort of alternating between them. And it just like didn't feel like it was working. And I had felt like that for a little while. I think there was something about it that felt like, okay, but like, why does the reader care about these two individual queer people living in West Philly in 2018? Like, what's the point? You know, I felt the need to have like a larger, more ambitious story, something that would make it clear to the reader like why we should care about these two young people who are going on a road trip, who are artists. Maybe they're falling in love. I was like, this isn't really, I'm not trying to write like a romance here. This isn't the vibe. And so I sort of was like sitting there being like, this isn't quite working. And it felt that way for a while. And then all of a sudden this like first person voice, just like, I almost had this like image of them literally like knocking on the window. I write in front of a window that sees a brick wall. Like,
yeah.
It's not exciting, but it was almost like this I voice was like knocking on the window. And she just started talking to me. The first lines were pretty much verbatim, like, where I live now, there is no art. And I was like, who's that? You know?
I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. It was very weird and almost like a little bit of a spiritual experience. Like, I was just like, whoa. And I was pretty far into the book by then. Like, we had sold it. I had rewritten it several times already. It definitely would have been easier to be like, nope, like, out you go. Like, no window entrance for you, like spectral voice. But I just felt like there was something interesting there that I wanted to see. I wanted to see who it was. So I just like kept following her. Yeah.
I love it. I think it is a good perspective, and I don't mean to gush over it. Maybe it's probably because I'm so close to the book. I should be more objective. I think it is a very interesting choice that you've made. I'll say it that way.
Thank you.
But I think it works because it really does encapsulate. It gives us another capsule to like kind of examine as we're looking at the story of Bernie and Leah. To go back to description for a minute, you did talk about Leah, who is fat, and based on the description of her body, you don't shy away from this. You break the rules, as you say, of description and actually bring some up, talking about their weight. And there's even a few times where you talked about her weight almost being an object of desire without it being like overt objectification, which I really appreciate. I'm assuming that it is intentional. But why is this type of visibility important to you?
For sure. Yes, I think that with Leah, I knew she was going to be fat from the beginning. I'm a fat person, if that's not clear, audio medium. And I felt interested in the idea of like a character who would feel a little bit shut out of this queer utopia that everyone else was building. Bernie is too a little bit because she's raised working class from rural PA, but Leah being fat, it's like queer people are just as fat phobic as everyone else,
Correct.
You know? And there is a very strong sense, I think, in these really tight queer spaces sometimes that like fat phobia and disability, I would say disability, the disability umbrella more broadly is sort of like the forgotten zone of things that people care about or kinds of oppression that people are thinking about. And yeah, Leah is, I wanted to write a character where her weight was not a problem. Like it wasn't something that was going to be solved by the end of the book. Where, you know, she's not like, this is bad and I have to fix it. But I also wanted to write a character who is fat, who isn't like, doesn't like complete their body liberation journey by the end of the book. Like isn't like, oh, now I love my body and it's done. Like doo-doo-doo, off I go. So I was interested in giving Leah like a bunch of reasons why she was feeling restless, dissatisfied, wanting to leave this community that she has been living in for a while and go on this road trip with Bernie. And I think one of them is for her to like work out what it is to be a fat person living in the world and traveling in the world, which like you've talked about and many other, there's lots of really interesting accounts popping up about like being fat while traveling, and specifically car travel is something that is much less safe for people of color, for trans and gender nonconforming people, and also for fat people. Like it's less comfy and it's less safe. And so I wanted to add that tension into the story of like, she's going on this very American classic road trip journey, but she also has, her body is in some ways, makes her different and makes her, it's a different kind of travel than Bernie traveling. Yeah.
I did take note that fatness was not a problem to solve in this, which is good, because I think there's another writer who I admire, Linda Holmes, who we've had on the show, who wrote a fat main character who I did not know was fat until at some point she mentions her size. She's talking about a dress she's wearing that she's loaning to a friend, and she mentions the size of the dress. And I remember thinking, one, I love that. Two, I clocked that, like, when it happened, because all of a sudden in my mind, and in my mind, when I looked at her in my mind, I'm like, all of a sudden the character changed. And and I think the idea of having fat folks be able to go on these adventures and it not be about their weight, I think is an important way to kind of mainstream and normalize all bodies. So I appreciate that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I should have said too that, like, it depends on what sort of data you're looking at. I just ran the numbers on this because I'm writing like an op-ed about it. But like, if you look at sort of, I hate these like medicalized terms, but if you look at like the percentage of Americans that are now quote unquote obese, it's almost half of America, right? And people that are now considered obese or overweight is like 73% of Americans. And so if you're writing fiction about America, you're writing about fat people fundamentally, like point blank. And also I did the math on this. I looked at the New York Times notable books from the past 5 years, and I looked specifically at the fiction titles, and less than 1% of them are about fat people, like have a fat character. And so that's important to me. I'm like, 1% is wild when we're looking at 73% of the country. Like, what a strange world we live in. Yeah.
I want to look at another passage from your book, which I think really points to your writing style. And it's on page 88. And it says, Bernie opened her laptop, which was at 15% battery. She made no move to fetch the charger, which was downstairs plugged in next to Mina's salt lamp. Bernie did this sometimes, taking no action, watching a small problem become a bigger one. So when I read this, I wrote it down that this is a remarkable, relatable articulation of life, which is also on page 50 for Leah, where during this moment of just big ambition, Leah decides that she feels this thing propelling her forward. And you write this passage: starting tomorrow, she would take her vitamins along with her antidepressants and go on a walk and drink a gallon of water every day. She would live for years, maybe even decades. She would live so long. And I remember reading both of these passages and thinking, again, remarkable, relatable articulations of life. And it kind of feels like a cousin or directly adjacent to the ways in which you're descriptive. Is that common for you to do, to like kind of like summarize life in this very relatable way?
Thank you. I think yes. I feel like that's why fiction is so fun and has been so enormously meaningful to me as a reader, is like you see these very specific things, like objects or places or moments, and then the author is able to kind of make meaning out of it in a way that maybe we're not always able to. So I'm glad that landed with you. You never know what's going to land with people. The salt lamp. Also, I was just like, I remember very vividly when I was like, before I met my partner, I was like, I just want to meet someone who, when I'm downstairs, they'll bring me my laptop charger from upstairs. Like, that's my goal. And that's how life is lived, right? Like on the level of like, where's the laptop charger, or like your vitamins, and if you're taking a walk or not. Like Leah's also has these like illusions of grandeur about how she's going to change her life, but she's really just the same person at the end of the day. You know?
I love that. I think that's what I related to so much, is this idea that you do get these sudden bursts of ambition, saying that you want to get up and go do the thing. You're about to change your life and do everything over again. And then, you wake up and you're the same person. But Emma, in a lot of ways, even though you wrote that passage, like, you are an accomplished writer. You have now written 2 books. I'm sure there will be more in the future. You are teaching, you're kind of becoming on your journey to becoming a thought leader when it comes to writing and this specific type of intersection. So what does it look like to kind of hold all those things, to say, like, you actually have done the thing that says, I am doing the ambitious thing that has changed my life, but also I'm a regular person who wants to bring their charger down to me. How do you balance that ambitious nature of being this person that's achieving goals and also being like a regular person who just wants to, eat a sandwich and watch your shows,
I surely do. I want all those things at the same time. Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious for your response too. I mean, I think like I think it's often so much about the body. Like, people are always saying, like, trust the body, trust the body. Like, we've gotten into this kind of space where there's, like, I think now more than ever, an understanding of, like, the body and mind are connected. And that's not how I was raised again. Like, I was raised like, you're just like a Mr. Potato Head with like a brain, and like the rest of your body is just like dead weight, you know? And I was like, oh, okay. And then now that I've learned about the body, I'm like, I can't just like sit at my desk all the time writing and being a Mr. Potato Head. Like, my body gets tired or in pain or hungry or curious or restless. Like, I think the more I sort of like tune into myself as a human being is helpful.
Yeah.
To like remember that I'm not I'm not just like a brain on stick legs, which is definitely how I was raised. But also, like, when we're talking about the narrator a little while back, like, I think the reason that I was also attracted to bringing in that first person voice is like, I think it makes the book sort of about this question of like, can art save your life, you know? And I think the answer is sort of like yes and no. Like, no, in the sense that like, we don't have healthcare in this country. We don't have any system that supports public art, basically, except for like some nice NEA grants. Like, thank you, NEA. And we don't have like, you know, and we have these huge ways in which people are not equal and are oppressed. Like, without systemic change, like, a book's not going to change your reality. A book's not going to house you or clothe you or offer you access, but like, stacked up, enough books like maybe can a little bit. And so I think I try to like keep things in perspective too, of like, I'm not out here changing the world, or it's not the same, but it is a certain like brick upon brick upon brick, where it's like, if you pile up the stories and enough of us are saying things that are about like being a person that's ambitious, that also thinks about justice, then maybe art can change your life a little bit. It can make it a little more delightful, a little more pleasurable, a little more livable. I think art can do that. Yeah.
That's a very practical approach to all of this. I think it's like, but it's very effective too. Like, it's practical yet effective, because I feel like reading your book, there's a number of feelings that some folks would describe as political that show up in the book. Like, we've talked already a little bit about gentrification, queer folks, informally Black spaces, organizing in the queer community, the intersection of all that, your feelings on academia and journalism, which if I had time to read another passage, I would read another one about how you feel about journalism, which was just,
oh my God.
I laughed hilariously. But basically, in some ways, I think you're both embracing and ribbing these concepts of wokeism in a way that can only be done by someone who truly understands these concepts. So you really found a way to kind of marry the activism with the actual creation of the work. How important is it for you to continue doing this in your third project, your fourth project, and all that? Are you only doing projects? Do you think you'll ever just do a project that's just like, you know, a murder mystery that doesn't have any of these elements in it?
Oh my God, totally. I mean, if anyone out here listening wants to give me like a life-changing book contract to write a gay novel about like the U.S. women's national soccer team, like, I'm here for that. Like, sometimes when my partner and I are like, we need money, I'm like, maybe I should do that.
Yeah.
But like, yes, no, it's essential. Like, I think that I know myself now at a certain point too, and it's like, I get bored easily. I get bored without these kind of bigger questions that have no answers to dig into. I think like, I tried to write a novel before this that was essentially like an expansion of a short story, and it just like was boring because I already knew what the story was trying to say. I'd already written the story version, and so like expanding it just to rack up pages was a good exercise for confidence building, but it wasn't it didn't have the charge of like, where am I going? Let's find it out. Let's use my fingers to sense what's coming, you know? And there's a few novels that I think like do things that I didn't know you can do on the page that helped me think about this, like, these questions of like big, quote unquote, political ideas on a fiction level. So like Sarah Thinkin Matthews' All This Could Be Different was like a big influence and something I'm very appreciative exists in the world, because in that book, she actually shows a group of young people who are working on a collective project about housing injustice and inequality, and she just like lets them have scenes of them talking to each other about like, what kind of housing do we need, what kind of housing do we want to create. And I was like, oh, you can do that? Like, you can put like organizing in a novel? I thought that would be like preachy or weird, but it isn't. Like, if you're staying connected to the scene and to the characters that are in that moment, who all have conflicting and interesting things to say about the topic, like that's what a novel is made of, is interesting scenes. So I don't know why that was so radical to me. But yeah, I think about this all the time. I'm like, could I get excited about something that is just purely for entertainment? I was definitely raised in a strongly sort of like, again, like secular Jew, anti-Zionist, like, you got to contribute to the world and be like productive at all hours of the day kind of family. So I think it's hard for me to, my partner's always joking that I need to appreciate like pleasure and joy and delight for those things' sake more than I do, and play, like to have fun with play. So maybe on my play journey in like 20 years, I'll be ready to write something that's just entertaining. I hope so. We're working our way there.
Emma Copley Eisenberg, thank you so much for being with us on Working today.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a delight.
Up next, Ronald and I will talk about the joy of taking on big, challenging projects, taking inspiration from places in our lives and representations of fatness in art. Ronald, I absolutely love that interview. Emma's book, Housemates, was high on my TBR pile, and it is now shut up to the #1 slot. And I know for a fact that our producer, Cameron, also bought a copy, so I'm buying it. I was really inspired by Emma's response to your last question, that it's almost easier for her to work on a big, complicated writing project where she has to stretch and invent and work really hard because, well, she gets bored when she works on something that she's done before or already knows how to do. I wonder, is that true for you too? Do you enjoy working on big, massive projects that feel almost impossible half the time?
Well, first, let me say I'm halfway through Housemates, and I'm going to the beach this weekend, so I will be finishing Housemates. So we should definitely have a little book club, the three of us, when we're done. When it comes to big, challenging projects, it feels like most of the work that I do these days tend to be like a little bit more ambitious. Like these ideas that live in my head tend to be a lot more ambitious than kind of like the regular everyday work that I'm doing, whether it's producing a podcast for someone else or it's producing my Always On show. But the ideas that I have that I really want to get out into the world, those tend to be the big challenging projects that feel impossible just to get out of my head. But there is something satisfying about starting to coax them out, pulling them out, writing them down on paper and going step by step. But do I enjoy it? I don't know, because I procrastinate a lot and I don't know how often I actually get that. It's not easy. I think that's the best way to say it. It's just not easy to coax those ideas out of my head. But when they're out, I definitely enjoy that I got them out.
Exactly.
But getting them out, that's the challenge.
Yeah, it's no fun. It's like I always think that when you've been in a job for a long time and you just kind of know what you're doing and it's not that challenging, there's a certain comfort in that. And if you go for another job, it's going to be hard because you'll have to start over and you'll have to learn everything. And that's really daunting. But there comes a point when it's kind of time. And I think that's true with creative ideas too.
Agreed.
I loved Emma's explanation of why she likes to write early in the day, because otherwise that anxious voice starts to ask, hey, so are you ever going to get any writing done today? And to be clear, I loved her very smart articulation, not the pernicious effects and the nasty voice. I wonder, are you also a get the hard work done at the beginning of the day person? And if so, is it for the same reason as Emma?
For me, it's not really the hard work as much as the important work or the work that I like the most, because I am a morning person and I do my best work when I wake up in the morning, cup of coffee, ready to go. Like that's when I feel like I'm really, superstar shining. Whereas it's not necessarily that I don't think it's like an inclination to do harder work. It's just the work that I care about the most, that matters the most to me. I want to get that done with the best version of me. I remember when I was working back in a corporate setting, I remember I would go to work early in the morning and I'd have all this energy and I'm like doing spreadsheets for this company. And at one point I realized I'm not giving them the best part of my day. So I'd just wake up early and I'd be like, I'm going to do some podcast stuff. So I'd be working on my stuff, producing, sending emails, all that stuff. And then when I ran out of that energy, then I would give them the spreadsheets energy and the stuff as I went on, because I'm like, who really cares about this? And for me, it was a gamble that paid off, because I'm like, you give the best work to yourself. So I think for me, the principle is like, you give your best version of you and your work to yourself, and then you give everybody else what's left.
Oh my God. Listeners, we may just have heard the most important piece of advice that has ever been on working. So clip that one for the ages. I found your exchange about the importance of seeing fat characters in literature, on TV, in art generally, really fascinating. Ronald, do you have a favorite piece of art that integrates fat characters in a way you found interesting? I feel like it would be really easy to come up with a really long list of awful representations of fat people in arts, but what about good ones?
So thinking about this question, I immediately am confronted with all of these representations of fat folks in media that are just representations, but not necessarily good ones. So two of them kind of floated to the top of my mind. One of them is on the Netflix movie by Rada Blank called The 40-Year-Old Version, which follows Rada Blank as she is reinventing herself as a rapper. And I think what I like about this is both she is a fat person and also she is 40. Mm-hmm. She is 40 plus, which I feel like in most cases you don't really get stories about folks who are 40 plus without it being solely about them being 40. Like there's other parts of life that she gets to experience in this film, which I think is really good. And the other one I would say is there was a show, rest in peace, called Grand Crew that was on NBC. And it was about this group of black friends that live in LA that, you know, would have this wine club where they would drink wine at this wine bar, hang out with each other. And there were two characters on there. There was Sherm and there was Nikki, who were both plus size characters. And the show never interrogated their weight. It never interrogated their weight. All it did was it just let them live their lives as plus size people, dealing with all of the same things that everyone else dealt with. And I feel like that is good. Weight can be a part of the narrative, but it doesn't always need to be something that characters or actors or everyone is contending with. We are contending with enough life that we don't necessarily need to be thinking about our weight in normal interactions with one another, because for some of us that's always going on in the back of our mind. So that depiction was very good. These were people that were deemed attractive and falling in love and experiencing breakups the same way all the straight size folks in the show were. So I really, really appreciated that.
Fantastic. Got to check it out. That's about all the time we have this week. We hope you have enjoyed the show. If you have, remember to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. That way you'll never miss an episode. And just a reminder that by joining Slate Plus, you'll get ad-free podcasts, extra segments on shows like Slow Burn, and you'll never hit a paywall on the Slate site. To learn more, go to slate.com/workingplus.
Thanks to Emma Copley Eisenberg and to our producer, Cameron Drews. We'll be back next week with Kristen Meinzer's conversation with actor and Colonial Williamsburg historical interpreter Stephen Seals. Until then, get back to work.
McDonald's presents Burger Reviews by Hamburglar. Today's review, the hotter, juicier classic burgers. Mr. Hamburglar, robble, robble. He said, of all the McDonald's burgers I've ever hamburgled, these are the hottest, juiciest, and tastiest. Brubble.
Hamburglary is on the rise. Get caught with a medium double cheeseburger meal for $6. Price and participation may vary. Promotion pricing may be lower than meal price. Comparison to prior classic burgers.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.